The days passed quickly, and Luke found himself waking up each morning with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The ranch had become more than just a place to hide from his past. It was now a place where he was learning to rebuild. Every day there was something new to do, a new task that needed attention. It wasn't just about work anymore. It was about building something real, something that mattered. And every time he looked around, he saw reminders of how much he had changed in the short time since he returned. The landscape, too, had become a place of reflection. The once distant hills, the quiet creeks, and the old oak trees now seemed to hold a deeper meaning for him. They weren't just landmarks of his childhood anymore. They were symbols of the journey he had taken, both physically and emotionally. The land had been there long before he was born, and would likely remain long after he was gone. And somehow it made him feel less alone. He was just one small part of something much bigger, and that thought gave him comfort. As much as the ranch was providing him with a sense of peace, it was also giving him something else. A second chance. A chance to understand himself, to make up for the mistakes he had made, and to learn how to forgive himself. He had spent so many years being angry at the world, angry at his choices, angry at the time he had wasted. But now there was no room for anger anymore. There was only room for moving forward. The weight of regret that had been so heavy on his shoulders seemed lighter now, as if it had finally begun to lift. Maggie had been there through it all. She had shown him the way, not with grand gestures, but with quiet wisdom and the kind of strength that only comes from having lived through hardships and come out the other side stronger. They spent more time together than ever before, working side by side on the ranch, but also talking, sharing, and learning from each other. One evening, as they finished up the day's work, Luke and Maggie sat on the porch, the warm breeze brushing past them. The sky above was clear, the stars shining brightly, just as they had so many nights before. But tonight felt different. It felt like a moment of change, of new beginnings. Luke leaned back in his chair, the wooden creaks of the porch beneath him familiar and comforting. "You ever think about the future?" Luke asked, his voice quiet but steady. Maggie looked over at him, her eyes thoughtful. "I think about it sometimes. But more than that, I think about the present. We can't control everything that happens in the future. All we can do is take it one step at a time and make the most of what we have right now." Luke smiled slightly, her words resonating with him more than he expected. For so long, he had been obsessed with the idea of what was coming next, always chasing something he couldn't quite grasp. But Maggie's words were a reminder that the future didn't have to be a place of fear. It could be a place of hope and possibility, but only if he allowed himself to live fully in the present. "Maybe that's the problem I've had," Luke said, his voice quieter now. "I've always been thinking about what's next, always trying to escape what I had before. But I never really stopped to enjoy what I have. I think I'm starting to understand that." Maggie's smile was soft, understanding. "We all get caught up in that. We think we need to run from things, thinking there's something better out there. But sometimes the best things are right in front of us. All we need to do is open our eyes and see them." Luke looked out at the ranch, taking in the land around him, the soft rustle of the leaves in the trees, the quiet sounds of the animals in the distance, and the steady rhythm of life here on the ranch. He realized that Maggie was right. He had spent so much time running from this place, from his past, from everything that reminded him of what he thought he had lost. But now, as he sat there with Maggie, watching the stars above, he could see that maybe he hadn't lost anything at all. He had simply needed to open his heart to what was already there. "I think I've been looking for peace in all the wrong places," Luke said, his voice reflecting the shift he felt within himself. "Maybe I've been trying to find something to fill a hole that I never really needed to fill." Maggie turned her head slightly to look at him, her eyes gentle. "We all have holes in our hearts, Luke. Some of them are big, some of them are small, but they're all part of who we are. The important thing is learning how to live with them, how to let them be a part of our story instead of something we try to hide." Luke took a deep breath, her words sinking in. He had spent so long running from his past, so focused on filling the gaps in his life that he had forgotten what was most important. It wasn't about filling those gaps, it was about understanding that they were part of him, part of the story that made him who he was. And just maybe those gaps weren't as painful as he had once believed. As the night went on, the conversation shifted and they talked about everything. Life, love, dreams, regrets, and everything in between. There were no more walls between them, no more hiding from the past. In that moment, Luke realized that this wasn't just about coming back to the ranch or healing from his past. It was about finding the courage to move forward, to let go of the weight he had carried for so long. In the days that followed, Luke made decisions he had never thought possible. He began working with Maggie more closely, taking on new challenges and pushing himself in ways he hadn't in years. Together, they restored parts of the ranch that had been neglected, turning the land into something that felt vibrant again. Every day, Luke felt more connected to the earth beneath his feet and to the life he was building with Maggie. One evening, after a long day's work, Luke sat alone on the porch, gazing out at the land. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over everything. He was no longer the young man who had run away. He wasn't the man who had carried the weight of regret for all those years. He was someone new, someone who had come to terms with his past and was learning to live in the present. Maggie joined him on the porch, sitting quietly beside him. "You look like a man who's found some peace," she said, her voice light but full of meaning. Luke turned to her, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "I think I have. It's not all figured out, but I'm getting there, and I'm not alone in it anymore." Maggie smiled back, her eyes soft. "You never were alone, Luke. You just needed to realize it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Luke felt a sense of calm that he had never known before. He was home. He was not just physically back on the ranch, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. He had found peace not in some far-off place, but in the here and now. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had everything he needed to build the life he had always wanted. Days passed, and the ranch, though quiet, became a place of healing for Luke. He had never expected that coming back to this land, which once felt so suffocating, would give him the peace he had been searching for. Every corner of the place held memories, some good, some painful. But now those memories didn't feel as heavy. They didn't feel like chains dragging him down. Instead, they seemed like parts of a story he was finally ready to understand. Luke spent his mornings working on the ranch, something he hadn't done in years. It felt natural, like he had never left. The tasks weren't as difficult as they had seemed when he was younger. Feeding the horses, checking the fences, and repairing the old barn. These were things he had done since he was a child. But now as he worked, something was different. His mind was clearer. There was a peace in his movements, a calmness that had been missing for so long. It wasn't just the work, though. It was the quiet, the stillness of the ranch, and the absence of the distractions that had once made him run away. Maggie had been there too, helping him with the work. She wasn't the kind of person who stood back and watched someone else do the work. No, Maggie was right there beside him, mending fences and taking care of the animals as if she had been doing it all her life. Luke had always admired her strength. It wasn't just physical, it was a quiet, internal strength. It was the kind of strength that kept her going no matter what life threw her way. Watching her work made Luke feel like he wasn't alone in this anymore. It wasn't just the ranch that was healing, it was his heart. One afternoon, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch, the sun beginning to dip behind the hills. The orange and pink hues of the sunset reflected off the landscape, painting the sky with colors that reminded Luke of the beauty he had long ignored. The air was cool, and the stillness of the ranch surrounded them. Luke didn't say much at first. He was still processing everything, how his heart was opening up, how his memories were shifting. But Maggie's presence was comforting, like an anchor that kept him grounded. She was sitting beside him, her eyes on the horizon, and for a moment Luke wondered what it had been like for her all these years. She had stayed, built a life here, while he had left and wandered. "Maggie," Luke said softly, breaking the silence. "How did you do it? How did you stay when everything fell apart?" Maggie glanced at him, her face softening as if she had been waiting for him to ask. She took a deep breath and then answered, her voice steady and calm. "It wasn't easy, Luke. It never is when you lose someone you love. But life doesn't stop just because we're hurting. I had to keep going. For myself, and for the people who depended on me. Sometimes it's not about moving on. It's about finding a way to live with the loss. I think that's what keeps us going. You don't forget, but you learn to live with the scars. The past doesn't disappear, but it doesn't have to control you either." Luke listened intently, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so much of his life trying to outrun his past, trying to escape the pain, But Maggie's words made him realize something. Maybe he didn't have to forget his past to move forward. Maybe it was about accepting it, understanding it, and then allowing himself the space to heal. "I think I've spent too much time running," Luke admitted, his voice quieter now. "From the ranch, from my mom, from everything. I've been trying to outrun a past that's been chasing me, and now I'm not sure where to go next." Maggie smiled softly, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "You don't have to know everything right away. You don't need a perfect plan. All you need is the willingness to try. Sometimes the next step isn't obvious. It's just about showing up, about being present in your own life." Luke nodded, feeling something inside of him begin to shift. It was like a door had cracked open in his heart, and for the first time in a long time he felt like he could walk through it. He didn't have to have all the answers, but he could take the first step. That was enough for now. Over the next few weeks, Luke found himself falling into a rhythm he hadn't known he needed. The ranch became a place of solace, a place where he could breathe without the weight of the world on his shoulders. He and Maggie worked side by side every day, each task a small part of the healing process. The work wasn't hard, but it was satisfying. There was something about the simple, repetitive tasks that helped Luke clear his mind and focus on the present. One evening, as they were finishing up in the barn, Luke looked over at Maggie, who was brushing down one of the horses. The setting sun bathed her in a warm golden light, and for a moment Luke just watched her. She was calm, centered, and there was a peace in her that he couldn't help but admire. He had spent so much of his life searching for something, anything, that could bring him peace. And now here it was, right in front of him. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way he had stopped thinking about running. He had stopped looking for an escape. He was no longer that young man who had left everything behind. He was a different person now, someone who had learned that it wasn't about fleeing from the past, but about learning from it and moving forward with a clearer heart. One evening, after they had finished working for the day, Luke sat down at the edge of the porch, watching the stars appear in the sky. Maggie joined him, sitting beside him in comfortable silence. It was moments like these that Luke cherished, the quiet moments, the ones that didn't require words but spoke volumes nonetheless. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left?" Luke asked quietly, looking at the stars above. Maggie smiled softly. "I think about it sometimes, but I don't regret how things turned out, Luke. Life is full of unexpected turns, and sometimes the paths we take lead us exactly where we need to be. I think we're both exactly where we're supposed to be, right here, right now." Luke turned to look at her, his heart full. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years he felt at peace with the present. There was no need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know what came next. What mattered was that he was here now with Maggie, working towards something real and meaningful. The past wasn't going anywhere, but it no longer had control over him. "I think I'm starting to believe that," Luke said softly, his voice filled with a quiet hope. "Maybe this is where I'm supposed to be." Maggie's smile deepened and she nodded. "I think you're right." As the night settled in around them, Luke leaned back and gazed at the stars. He didn't know what the future held, but in this moment he didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days following the funeral were a blur of emotions and quiet reflection. Luke hadn't expected to stay long, but something about being back on the ranch felt different. There was a peace here, a stillness he hadn't known in years. It wasn't just the land or the familiar sights of his childhood. It was something deeper, something that seemed to pull at him from within. It was as if the ranch was calling him, asking him to come to terms with everything he had left behind. Luke found himself wandering the familiar paths around the ranch, almost without thinking. His boots crunched on the gravel roads as he walked, the sound of his steps echoing in the silence. The fields, though overgrown and slightly wild, still had the same beauty he remembered. The air smelled the same, earthy and fresh. In the distance, the old barn stood tall, weathered by time but still standing firm. As he made his way toward the barn, Luke found himself lost in thought. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this place, even if it hadn't always been easy. The memories of his mother, the long days of working the land together flashed before his eyes. But they weren't all bad memories. There were moments of joy, too. That was when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Maggie, Maggie," Luke said, almost to himself. He hadn't realized how much he had come to rely on her presence over the past few days. She had become a comfort, someone who seemed to understand him in a way that few others could. She had been there during the funeral, and now she was here again, just as steady and calm as always. Luke had no idea what had drawn her to stay in this small town, but something in the way she spoke about her life made him think she had found a certain peace here. She had lost a husband, but she had endured. She had stayed. "Mind if I walk with you?" Maggie asked, her voice soft. But there was a gentleness in it that made Luke feel at ease. "Not at all," Luke replied, turning to face her. The two of them walked together in silence for a few moments. It wasn't awkward, just quiet, the kind of silence that comes when two people share an understanding without needing to fill the air with words. Luke didn't know exactly why he felt so comfortable with Maggie, but he did. She wasn't like anyone else. She had this ability to make him feel like he wasn't broken, like maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to something that resembled peace. "Tell me something," Maggie said, breaking the silence. "What's it been like being away all these years?" Luke glanced at her, not quite sure how to answer. He had spent so much time burying his thoughts, not allowing himself to really reflect on it. But something about Maggie's question made him want to share, to open up. "It's been a mix of everything," Luke admitted. At first it was freedom, just pure, wild freedom. But then after a while it became lonely. You start chasing things you think will make you happy, but then you realize you're just running away from something deeper. Maggie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I get that. After Tom passed away, I thought I'd lost everything. I didn't know who I was anymore. But then I realized I was still here. I was still breathing. And sometimes just being alive is enough. You can rebuild even when it feels like there's nothing left." Luke stopped walking, taken aback by her words. There was so much wisdom in her voice, a quiet strength that Luke had never expected from her. "I don't know if I can rebuild. I've been gone so long, and now my mother's gone. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with myself anymore." Maggie stopped beside him, her eyes soft and understanding. "Sometimes you don't need to know everything at once. You don't need to have all the answers right now. But you have to start somewhere, even if it's just one small step." Luke was silent for a moment, thinking about what she said. It seemed so simple, so straightforward. Yet he knew it wasn't. It was easier said than done. The pain of his past, the guilt of leaving, and the confusion about where he belonged still hung over him like a cloud. "I don't know where to start," Luke finally said, his voice quiet. "You start by being here," Maggie said softly. "You start by letting go of the past and just allowing yourself to be in this moment." Luke stared at the ground for a moment, trying to process what she had said. He had spent so long focusing on what he had lost, on all the regrets he carried with him. But Maggie was right. Maybe it was time to stop running from the past and start living in the present. "I think I've been so focused on running from everything that I haven't stopped to look at what's right in front of me," Luke confessed, finally looking up at her. "Maybe that's the problem. I'm afraid of facing what's here, what's left." Maggie smiled gently, and for the first time in a long while, Luke felt something inside him shift. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something was starting to change. "That's the first step, Luke. Acknowledge where you are and then take one step at a time. That's all any of us can do," Maggie said. They continued to walk, their conversation flowing more easily now. It wasn't just about the past anymore. They talked about the ranch, about the changes in the town, and even about the small joys of life, like the beauty of the sky at sunset, the feel of the cool breeze on their faces, and the memories of simpler times. As they walked back toward the house, Luke felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from expecting everything to be perfect. It was a quiet, steady hope, the kind that came from accepting the present and knowing that no matter what, there was still time to make things right. Maggie's presence had given him a glimpse of that hope. She had shown him that it wasn't too late to rebuild, to find peace, and maybe even to start over. As they approached the porch, Luke realized that he wasn't alone in this anymore. He had Maggie, and maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to a life that didn't feel so broken. "Thank you," Luke said, looking at her with a soft smile. "I didn't think I needed someone to tell me this, but I did. I don't think I'd be able to figure any of this out without you." Maggie smiled, her eyes reflecting a warmth that made Luke feel more at ease than he had in years. Sometimes all we need is someone to remind us that we don't have to do it alone. As the evening settled in, the stars began to appear in the sky above. The world felt quieter, simpler somehow. Luke didn't know where the journey would take him, but for the first time he was ready to take that first step. Luke stood at the back of the church, his eyes scanning the familiar faces, though many of them seemed like strangers now. His mother had always been an integral part of this community. Everyone knew her, and everyone seemed to have a story about how she had helped them in some way. But Luke, standing there in silence, felt detached from it all. He had left when he was young, convinced that there was nothing left for him here. Yet now that he was back, it felt like the world had moved on without him and he was the one left behind. The weight of that realization sank deep into his chest. The funeral service was respectful, formal, and kind, but it didn't provide Luke with the comfort he had hoped for. The preacher spoke kind words about his mother's kindness, her unwavering faith, and her strength as a woman. Those who knew her shared stories, some heartfelt and others humorous, recalling the little things about her that made her so special. But for Luke, all those memories felt distant. They seemed to belong to a version of his mother that he never fully understood. His mind drifted as the ceremony continued. He wasn't quite present, lost in his own thoughts. The sound of the preacher's voice faded into the background, replaced by a quiet stillness in Luke's mind. He thought about all the years he had been away. There had been so much time for him to come back and mend the rift between him and his mother, but he hadn't. He had been too busy with his own life, too caught up in the demands of being a cowboy, always on the move, always thinking there would be time for everything later. But now there was no later. He had come back too late. After the service, the family gathered outside for a brief moment of quiet reflection. It felt strange to Luke, standing there amidst the people who were supposed to be his family but felt so unfamiliar. The wind blew gently, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and dust, reminders of the life he once knew but had long since abandoned. He stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to say to anyone. He had always been the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit in. It was then that he noticed her standing off to the side, almost as if she were waiting for him. Maggie Moore. Seeing her again took him by surprise. Maggie had been a part of his life once, a long time ago. Back when he was still young and naive before life had hardened him. They had been inseparable during their high school years, and for a while, Luke had thought they would be together forever. But he left, thinking there was something bigger out there for him, something more than the life she wanted. He had left her behind without so much as a second thought, pursuing the freedom he believed was his destiny. Maggie, however, had stayed. She had married another man, lived a life that had brought its own set of challenges. She had endured the loss of her husband and, from the looks of it, had come through it all with grace and strength. But standing there, watching her, Luke couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had never really given her the closure she deserved. She wasn't as young as she once was, but there was a certain radiance to her. It wasn't the same girl he had left behind. This Maggie was older, wiser, but still the same in some ways. Her eyes, deep and warm, met his, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. There was no harshness between them, no bitterness, just the quiet acknowledgement of what once was and what could have been. Maggie smiled gently, her expression soft but not entirely free of the weight of the years. She walked over to him, her step steady and calm. Her presence was a comfort, and Luke felt a strange mixture of emotions all at once: guilt, regret, and yet a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Luke," she said softly, her voice carrying the same warmth he remembered from years ago. "Maggie," he replied, his voice low, unsure of what to say. They stood there for a moment in silence, both of them caught between the past and the present. It felt like a strange reunion, like the distance of time had made everything both clearer and more complicated. "I didn't think you'd come back," Maggie said finally, her words simple but heavy with meaning. "I thought maybe you had forgotten about this place." Luke swallowed hard. "I didn't forget. I just didn't know if I could face it." Maggie nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "It's not easy coming back after all this time. But sometimes we have to face things we've been running from." Luke stared at her, the simplicity of her words striking him deeply. She had faced her own demons, losing a husband, living through the hard times that had come her way, and yet she seemed at peace. more at peace than he had ever felt in his life. I never got a chance to say goodbye to her, Luke admitted quietly, the guilt surfacing. To my mom. I was too busy running away, and now she's gone, and I don't know how to make peace with that. Maggie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read the hurt and regret written there. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to make peace with it all at once, Luke. Sometimes healing takes time, and sometimes it starts with forgiving yourself. Luke's chest tightened at her words. Forgiveness. That was something he had never truly given himself. He had spent so many years angry at his past, angry at his family, angry at the choices he had made. But hearing Maggie speak in that calm, understanding tone made him realize how much he had been carrying. Maybe it was time to let go of some of that anger. Maggie smiled softly, then turned her gaze back to the ranch. It's hard to come back to a place like this, she said, her voice softer now. But it's also where we learn what really matters. Maybe it's time for you to remember why you left and why you're back. Luke felt a lump form in his throat as he looked out across the ranch. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the land. It was beautiful, just like it had always been. But for the first time, Luke didn't feel the need to escape. He didn't know what he was looking for yet, but something about Maggie's words made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could find it here. As the evening wore on, Luke and Maggie talked more about their lives, their losses, their choices. The old tension between them had faded, replaced by a sense of understanding. They weren't the same people they had been when they were young, but they had both changed in ways that made them stronger. Luke realized as they talked that maybe coming home wasn't just about saying goodbye to his mother. Maybe it was about finding a way to say goodbye to the past that had held him back for so long. And maybe, just maybe, Maggie was the one who could help him do that. Luke Harris had spent the better part of his life running. Running from his past, running from the small town he once called home, and most of all, running from the weight of his own memories. He'd traded the quiet of the ranch for the wide open skies of the cowboy life. For years, he worked on various cattle ranches, moving from one job to the next, never staying too long in one place. The call of the open range, the thrill of the ride, and the endless horizon had allured him. But deep down, he knew it was more than just the freedom he was seeking. It was escape. He'd left home when he was just a young man, filled with the ambition and fire of youth. But his departure wasn't as much about chasing dreams as it was about running from a family that had never understood him. His relationship with his mother had been strained, to say the least. She was a strong woman, a loving mother in her own way. But her love often came with expectations that Luke couldn't meet. There had been arguments, misunderstandings, and moments when the tension between them felt like it could tear them apart. And then there was his father, a man whose silence had always loomed over the house, casting a shadow that made everything feel heavy and suffocating. So, when the opportunity came to leave, Luke didn't hesitate. The world outside the ranch seemed like the answer to everything that felt wrong at home. He was young and naive, but the pain of not feeling understood was enough to push him away. He had to find himself, he told himself. He had to make something of his life to prove that he was more than just a small-town cowboy who couldn't live up to anyone's expectations. Now, years later, standing in the middle of a dusty street in a town that felt both too familiar and completely foreign, Luke couldn't help but feel the weight of what he was about to do. He had received the news just days before, a short, cold message from his cousin. Your mama passed away this morning. The funeral's on Friday. Thought you'd want to know. No real sentiment, just the blunt delivery of facts. But it hit Luke like a ton of bricks. He'd spent so many years avoiding his family, avoiding the painful memories of growing up. And now his mother was gone. There was no second chance to make things right. The guilt hit him harder than he expected. He had never told her he loved her, never said goodbye the way he should have. The thought that he had waited so long to come back that now it was too late gnawed at his insides. Luke didn't know if he was ready to face the past, but there was no avoiding it. He had to return home. The ride would take him several days that he spent mostly in silence, reflecting on everything he had left behind. The quiet hum of his horse's hooves on the dusty trail was a steady reminder of the journey ahead. The rolling hills, the distant mountains, and the endless sky all felt the same as they did when he was a boy. Yet everything felt different. Maybe it was because he was no longer the same man. The boy who had left this place was gone, replaced by a man who had seen too much, who had endured the harshness of life and yet still carried scars from his past. He thought about his mother often as he rode, remembering how she would work tirelessly on the ranch, managing the house and taking care of the animals. She had always been there in the background, a constant presence in his life. But there had been times, too many times, when they clashed, her demanding, his defiance, and his father, always distant, never stepping in to help bridge the gap. It was hard for Luke to think of his mother without remembering the times they fought. The arguments that felt so important then now seemed trivial, yet they still stung like they were fresh. The landscape began to change as he got closer to the ranch. The open plains gave way to familiar rolling hills and then the winding roads that led him to the outskirts of town. He had been gone so long that the town felt like a place he no longer recognized. The buildings were older, some of them run down, but the streets were the same. The old church where his mother had always prayed, the diner where he used to grab coffee before heading out to the fields, and the small grocery store that always smelled of fresh bread. Everything was just as it had been. But he wasn't the same. Luke arrived at the ranch just as the sun was beginning to set. The golden light bathed the land, making it look as beautiful as he remembered. But as he rode up the familiar driveway, a sense of heaviness settled in his chest. The ranch was quiet now, emptier than he remembered. He dismounted and walked toward the house, his boots making soft thuds on the gravel. The porch, where his mother had once sat in the evenings, was empty now. There was no rocking chair, no signs of life. He had imagined coming back to find it all the same, but it wasn't. His mother was gone, and the home he once knew felt like a ghost of itself. The door creaked as Luke pushed it open. Inside, the house smelled like it always had, of wood, old furniture, and faint traces of his mother's perfume. Everything was in its place, but there was a stillness that hung in the air. It was as if the house itself was grieving. Luke's heart ached, and for the first time in years, he felt like a child again, lost and unsure of how to move forward. The living room was filled with relatives, distant cousins and aunts and uncles who had all come to pay their respects. But Luke didn't recognize most of them. He hadn't stayed in touch, hadn't written or called. The distance between him and his family had only grown over the years. He was a stranger in his own home now. His father sat quietly in the corner, looking like he had aged decades in the time Luke had been away. Their eyes met, but neither of them spoke. The silence between them was more uncomfortable than any words could have been. As the service began, Luke found a seat at the back of the room, wanting to stay out of the way. He didn't feel like he belonged here, but he had no choice. This was his mother's final farewell. The preacher spoke about her life, about the kindness she had shown to the people of the town, about the strength she had as a woman. Luke listened, but the words didn't reach him. All he could think about was how much time he had wasted, how much he had missed out on, how much he wished he had come back sooner. But there was no turning back the clock now. His mother was gone, and nothing could change that. The service ended, and Luke felt a sense of relief wash over him. It was over, but deep inside he knew this was just the beginning. The weight of the past was still there, pressing down on him, and the question that had been haunting him ever since he received the news loomed large in his mind. What now?